Has started. Good morning, happy Friday, everyone. And Prithvi, floor is yours.
Okay. Hey guys, this is Prithvi Reddy. I'm a CSA here in the South Central region. Today we're going to be talking about Private Link with AKS. Private Link was a service that was released in the November timeframe of last year, soon after Ignite. One of the main reasons for Private Link is to have private access to services. One of the services is very popular within Azure is AKS in order to build Kubernetes clusters. So let me bring up a quick diagram of how Private Link service will work with AKS. Is everybody able to see my screen?
I can see that. Yes.
Okay. So previously, before we had Private Link, whenever you ran the kubectl commands, kubectl commands are required to either build your containers or make configuration changes within your cluster. Those kubectl commands had to go to a public endpoint. The whole purpose of Private Link is to make that communication with the cluster completely private. So in this example here, we call this a Bastion subnet. Typically, this is where customers will put a jump server. Jump server accesses a private endpoint, and that private endpoint is connected to what's referred to as a private link service. So when you run a kubectl command, the kubectl command is running within your network, a well-known environment, and you don't have to worry about, controlling firewall rules and whether someone gets access to your public endpoint. Now they can run kube commands against your cluster. So that's a little bit of the background on what the benefits of Private Link. Any questions? And any questions about this setup? So this is mainly to control access to kubectl commands that are run on the AKS cluster and making sure those are completely private. Okay, so if there's no questions, we'll run through just a quick example.
Hey, is it just a IaaS VM?
On the left-hand side of this diagram?
Yeah.
So this is just a jump server VM that's used to run the Kubernetes commands, kubectl commands against the cluster. So it could be your client. This could be your client VM or your PC in your home office as well. It doesn't have to be a VM in Azure. As long as there's routing available to this endpoint, you should be good to go.
Thank you.
So for this example, we're using a jump server VM, but it can be your own VM or your own client.
Just you may want to explain, Prithvi, that this is only for the API server of the AKS cluster. This is not for the Ingress, the private link.
Correct. This is only for the API server, meaning this is how you the kubectl commands that are used to create your containers. Any YAML file updates that you need. But as Naveed mentioned, if you need to actually access a container, that would be yet another. You could create another private endpoint and have private access to the actual service endpoint. But that's a separate use case. This is mainly for the control plane only. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. All right, guys. So one of the first steps that, if you're familiar with the AKS create command, this is all pretty straightforward. But one of the main differences when you run it against a private cluster, there's an extra flag here called -- enable private cluster. This does take a little bit of time to run, so I'm not going to show this on the demo. So I previously ran this here, as you can see here. So I did a AKS create. You specify the name of your cluster, the resource group it's going to go into. Now, one of the things with private link, there will always be a load balancer SKU of standard. It has to be standard. This flag is something new with private link, the -- enable private cluster. This essentially enables monitoring. The Kubernetes version, those of you who have been working with Kubernetes, you can basically run this command right here. It does an AKS get versions. It shows you all the Kubernetes versions available for that region. In this case, I just used the latest version. We generated SSH keys, and the location of this cluster is in East US 2. So once the cluster is created, one of the key things to keep in mind is that all the cluster resources go into something called an MC resource group. Oops, I think I hear some echo. Okay, it's gone now. So this cluster that was created in East US 2, you'll see here that there's an MC resource group that has been created for it. All of the AKS clusters that are being deployed in Azure now, the underlying nodes themselves are a VM scale set. So you'll see the scale set there. And here's where you see that there is a default private endpoint deployed within the VNET of the cluster. This is great. You can access that endpoint if you had a VM or a client within the VNet of the cluster. But in most of your use cases, going back to the diagram, you will most likely have some sort of landing zone or a jump server in a different VNet, and you need that VM to be able to access this cluster. So we're going to go through that example of creating another endpoint in a Bastion resource group, and then we're going to connect that endpoint to this cluster. Is everybody following so far? Okay. So I have another tab opened up here. This is my Bastion VNet, Bastion VM VNet, and I've already got a VM provisioned in there. But now I'm going to create a private endpoint within that VNet. So the command to do that, these are all AZ commands. You can also use the REST API if you're more familiar with that. The first command is we're going to create a subnet, and we're going to update it to disable private endpoint network policies. It's one of the first things you have to do. I'm going to come down here.
Basically, you have to do that to make sure that you can do private endpoint in that subnet.
Yeah, so let's pick a different subnet here. So so I have a subnet here called ACR subnet. Let's use this. Sorry.
Are you using a resource group and subscription? Because it seems like it could not find it.
Yeah, it should be right. So this is the Bastion resource group, and ACR subnet is the name of our subnet.
Hold on, go back. I mean, go back there. I think.
One second. Let me make sure I set the right subscription.
Yeah, I think that's the reason.
One second. So if you guys are aware of the AZ account set, we have to make sure that it's in the right scope. We'll make sure the name is correct. ACR and then lowercase subnet. It's also case sensitive. Gotta make sure your subnet name is spelled correctly. Resource group is Bastion. Okay. So we'll this is the command. I'm gonna move ahead, but the first step is you have to update the subnet. We have to create an endpoint. So I'm gonna move on to this next step because I've already run it against this this subnet. So we're gonna create an endpoint within this subnet. So what's
Basically,
the endpoint is? Yeah,
you're creating a private endpoint?
Yeah, we're creating a private endpoint within the Bastion resource group. So if we go to our Bastion resource group, so here's a private endpoint we've created for the Kube API. This private endpoint is connected to the cluster that we created earlier. So if you open up the endpoint, this endpoint points at the cluster. So the way that you get this cluster resource ID in the command line, it's pretty straightforward. Essentially, after you create your cluster, you're going to get the resource ID of the cluster, and I'll share all the scripts for this. But you'll basically attach the endpoint to the cluster. Once all that is done, I'm gonna log into the VM, and we're going to be able to run the kubectl commands against this cluster that was created. So I have this jump server that was previously created. So I'm going to SSH to it. Oops, that's not it. Sorry, guys. And then whenever I do a kubectl get nodes, I'm able to control the Kubernetes API privately from my VM. There is one more step that was required in order to make all this happen. This VNet is in a different VNet than the cluster itself. So within the MC resource group, there's something called the private DNS zone. So let me go to the cluster, one of the clusters that I'd previously created. And you'll see there's a private DNS zone record here. So when the kubectl command runs, it needs to be able to resolve this DNS name. So essentially the cluster name is always going to be AKS-ATT clus. This is the A record dot this name that ends with IO. However, this record is in a 10.240 network. The private endpoint itself is in a different network. So it's in the VNet. It's in the Bastion VNet. So what you have to do is in the MC resource group, under virtual network links, you'll go in here and you'll attach the additional VNets to this DNS zone. That way, this private record can resolve to this name. So if we go back to our Bastion resource group, so we'll switch back to Bastion. See this in our Bastion resource group, I've created a private DNS zone that looks exactly like the private DNS zone that we saw in the MC resource group. However, the A record is going to point at our private endpoint. So it has the same suffix, domain name, but here AKS-ATT class AKS demo is pointing at 10.0.3.4. So where did I get the IP for 10.0.3.4? If I go back to my Bastion resource group, I created a private endpoint, right, called private kube API endpoint. So if I click on that endpoint, his private IP is 10.0.3.4. So essentially with the private DNS zone, what we're saying is when your jump server or your client VM resolves to this IP, it's going to be attached to the DNS name of your Kubernetes cluster. Any questions there? And that is how on this jump server it's able to resolve that name. If I do an NS lookup here of that long name, go back here to the private DNS zone. So the name of the cluster is AKS. So jump back here. This guy, dot. The rest of the name is, it ends with IO. That's the DNS zone. You'll see here that the record, oops, here guys. Basically, the record will point at the private endpoint. See that AKS cluster name is using a private IP out of my Bastion VNet 10.0.3.4. We've created a private DNS zone pointing at that name, and the private endpoint is attached to our private cluster, and that is how we're able to connect to that cluster privately. I know it's a lot of information to digest, but I'm going to pause here for a second. Does all this make sense? We created a private endpoint, we created a private DNS, and we linked that VNet, our Bastion VNet, to the MC resource group. We took that private DNS zone, also created it in our Bastion resource group. And I'll share all the scripts after the call, but that's basically it.
And you sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You can have multiple Bastion VNets or subnet attached to that AKS cluster, right?
Correct. So you can have any number of Bastion VNets, but you will have to create an endpoint for each of those, right? Let's say you had another Bastion VNet called 10.2. It's in a completely separate VNet, completely separate subnet. You would create a separate endpoint for that, and then that endpoint would need to also be associated with that AKS resource ID. So it's a one-to-one mapping. It's not a one-to-many. Okay. If that makes sense. So.
And just keep in mind that, I mean, do you need, and Prithvi, can you explain, like, you don't have to have a DNS zone. I mean, you can do it with, if you just have one VM, like local on-prem, you can do it with host file, or if you are running Linux, like host file.
Yeah, good point, Naveed. So yes, if you're Linux, you can always edit your etc host file, and you could just as easily add an entry for your private endpoint. So in this case, I actually added a private DNS zone, but you could just as easily say 10.0.3.4 resolves to that cluster name, right? The one that ends with 0, the IO. Does that make sense? And then in Windows, you can do the same thing with host files. Host files, a lot of developers like to use host files. It's easy. You don't have to, talk to your network team to get a DNS entry created. And you can use it for testing. It makes it a lot simpler for testing.
And one other thing you may want to mention why we needed this private link, because previously this API address used to be a public FQDN. Is that
Correct. Yeah. So all of this traffic, this kubectl traffic, the Kubernetes API was exposed on the public internet, so it wasn't part of your VNet. So there was always the potential that if someone got your credentials, they could make changes to your AKS cluster through your public endpoint, right? So this is a more secure solution because it's running within your VNet, within your environment. It's all private. It's all in a 10 dot address space, RFC 1918. So you're never traversing the internet to control your cluster, right? So you're probably thinking, oh, I already have an AKS cluster. I've been using the public endpoint all these years. Um, you you will have to go through a migration in that scenario. Basically, deploy a new cluster that's, as I mentioned earlier, that has the enable private cluster flag. Um, take all of your containers, and you'll have to migrate them into your private cluster. How many of you are using Kubernetes today, or plan on using Kubernetes?
Yeah, feel free to IM or open your speakers and mics and speak.
We
I'll
are.
stop sharing. And are you planning to move to private clusters? I guess this is the second question.
Yes, we're
And
actually in the process of doing that.
okay.
And we are running some challenges. We're working with a couple of Microsoft guys out of the East Coast. We're running like AKS node with Databrick. We're running like 25,000, 50,000 nodes.
Wow. Okay. And what kind of issues are you running into? We could probably help you if you need any help.
It's some of the challenges with private links is I think the DNS is one piece because we want to have multiple area accessing, and of course, getting IT to change DNS is like 3 months process.
I see.
So we have that. I think the other one we had was basically not all services behave the same. There's difference in storage account, data like Gen 2, and then some of the ADF stuff behave differently. So we're noticing some like nuance differences between those.
That's good. And the second thing is, just keep in mind that any traffic between master nodes and worker nodes in AKS is all on private channels anyway. So that is not exposed. So
Yeah.
you're covered there. The last piece of that is the ingress controller. So if you are using an ingress controller that is based on standard load balancer, you can use a private ingress controller and then expose it over private link. So that traffic will also stay off the internet. So that's another thing that you can do. But with that, you can have your cluster totally private.
Yeah, I think that's the goal. It's that way we don't have to deal heavily with security if we are exposed to the internet, and then we have to deal a lot more with security. And then if we basically keep it private, then the security requirement is definitely less for us. So that's the reason why we're using it.
Any other questions? And by the way, this support is not available through the UI. The only way to do it is with the CLI.
Do you know how would synapses work with private links?
Let's take it offline, man.
Okay.
Synapse, you don't, because I think it is you're talking about Synapse, the new
Yes,
service,
the new,
yeah,
yep.
or maybe renamed service, yeah. I think the support is gonna be there at some point. I don't know the timeline. Let's connect offline on that, Tony.
Okay.
Any other questions, folks? Questions, comments, feedback? As usual, we will upload the session, recording as well as the slides and any other information. So
Yeah, I think it's great you guys providing this feature set. It's really helping out our guys with the big data solutions. Because before we were not able to keep everything private.
Yep. And the CLI commands, I know that we had a little bit of snafu with the subnet there, but I will update those CLI commands to like a GitHub location, so you can pull down the scripts if you'd like and start kicking the tires with it in your environment.
So if there are no other questions, I will give everybody 2 minutes back. And Prithvi, thank you for presentation. It's excellent information. So hope to see everybody next week. And by the way, go to azurepowerlunch.com. We had upcoming session as well as our YouTube channel. So download the recordings from there. Thank you, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks, Prithvi.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
That's great.